The seeker stands at the threshold of an ancient paradox. In an age where information flows freely and self-improvement saturates every corner of digital consciousness, the pursuit of self-knowledge has become democratized, sanitized, stripped of its original peril. Yet the Hermetic tradition, stretching from the mythical figure of Hermes Trismegistus through the alchemical laboratories of Paracelsus to the analytical psychology of Carl Jung, has always maintained a more ominous truth. To know oneself is not merely difficult, it is dangerous. This danger is not metaphorical. It is ontological, psychological, and irreversible. The question that forms the genesis of this inquiry is not whether self-knowledge is valuable, but whether the unprepared psyche can survive its encounter with itself. The Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," was not carved as an invitation to pleasant introspection, but as a warning. The temple of Apollo housed not only wisdom, but the oracle's vapors, which could intoxicate, madden, or illuminate. Similarly, the Corpus Hermeticum, that foundational text of Western esotericism, compiled in the early centuries of the Common Era, presents gnosis not as a comfort, but as a transformative fire that consumes the false self entirely. Dennis William Hawke, in his comprehensive study The Emerald Tablet, reminds us that the Hermetic path was never meant for the masses. It required initiation, preparation, and above all, the willingness to die psychologically before one could be reborn. Eliphas Levi, the 19th century occultist who revitalized Western magical tradition, emphasized that the aspirant must possess not only intellectual capacity, but moral fortitude. For the powers unleashed through self-knowledge could corrupt as easily as they could liberate. Manly Palmer Hall, in his encyclopedic work on secret teachings, noted that ancient mystery schools screened candidates rigorously, understanding that unguarded knowledge delivered to the unprepared was a form of poison. The Hermetic axiom, "as above, so below," encoded in the Emerald Tablet, is not simply a statement about cosmic correspondence. It is a declaration that the macrocosm's laws operate within the microcosm of the individual psyche, and to tamper with that inner universe without understanding its architecture is to risk psychological cataclysm. Ignorance, then, is not merely the absence of knowledge but a protective membrane, a necessary veil that shields the ordinary consciousness from truths it cannot yet integrate. To tear that veil prematurely is to invite chaos. The Hermetic system operates on multiple interlocking principles, each revealing layers of correspondence between psychological states and cosmic realities. At its foundation lie the 7 Hermetic principles articulated in the Kybalion, that early 20th century interpretation of Hermetic philosophy. These principles, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, constitute not merely abstract concepts, but operational laws governing both consciousness and cosmos. The principle of mentalism establishes that the all is mind, and that the phenomenal universe exists within a cosmic consciousness. Applied psychologically, this principle aligns with Jung's assertion that the psyche is not merely within us, but that we exist within the psyche. The external world we navigate is fundamentally a projection of internal archetypal structures. To gain self-knowledge is to recognize that what we experience as objective reality is saturated with subjective meaning, making every perception an act of interpretation laden with unconscious content. The principle of correspondence provides the Hermetic key. As the cosmos operates, so does the soul. This principle establishes the legitimacy of using alchemical symbolism to map psychological transformation. When medieval alchemists described the transformation of base metals into gold, they encoded a psychological process where the undifferentiated, unconscious contents of the psyche undergo systematic refinement into integrated consciousness. The 3 philosophical principles of alchemy, salt, sulfur, and mercury, correspond respectively to body, soul, and spirit, or in Jungian terms, to the material basis of consciousness, the emotional instinctual life, and the transcendent function that mediates between conscious and unconscious. This alchemical triad intersects profoundly with Kabbalistic structures. The tree of life's 3 pillars, mercy, severity, and equilibrium, mirror the alchemical necessity of balancing opposing forces. Salt represents fixity and structure, severity. Sulfur embodies desire and transformation, mercy, while Mercury serves as the mediating principle, equilibrium, that allows transformation without disintegration. The aspirant must understand that each principle exists within the psyche, and the great work consists of bringing these into conscious harmony rather than unconscious conflict. The connection to Neoplatonism deepens this architecture. Plotinus described the soul's descent into matter and its potential return to the One through progressive purification. This vertical cosmology finds hermetic expression in the concept of the 7 planetary spheres, through which the soul descends at birth, acquiring at each level a particular limitation or garment. Self-knowledge, then, becomes the systematic reversal of this descent, the removal of these accumulated layers of conditioning, desire, and identification with the material. The Rosicrucian tradition, emerging in 17th century Europe, synthesized these streams into a Christian Hermetic framework. The chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz presents initiation as a death and resurrection process, where the old self must be completely dissolved before the new can emerge. This text influenced Jung profoundly, informing his understanding of the individuation process as a dangerous but necessary journey toward wholeness. Yet the danger of this knowledge lies precisely in its power to destabilize. The ordinary ego operates within a carefully constructed consensus reality, maintained by social conditioning, psychological defenses, and selective attention. To apply Hermetic principles seriously is to undermine this stability deliberately. The aspirant learns that their personality is not a given, but a construct, that their most cherished beliefs may be projections, and that forces operate within them of which they have no conscious awareness. This realization can be liberating or devastating, depending on the individual's psychological resilience and ethical foundation. The mentality required of the adept is therefore not one of mere curiosity, but of disciplined will and ethical commitment. The concept of true will in Western esotericism, later formalized by Aleister Crowley, but rooted in earlier Hermetic texts, refers not to egotistical desire, but to the individual's authentic purpose, discovered only through the painful stripping away of false identifications. The occultist's ethics demand radical honesty, the willingness to confront one's shadow without flinching, and the courage to act in accordance with discovered truth rather than comfortable illusion. The disposition toward doubt is equally essential. The Hermetic tradition distinguishes between the doubt of the skeptic, who refuses all claims, and the doubt of the disciple, who questions everything, including their own perceptions and motivations. This radical empiricism of the inner life requires testing each realization against experience, maintaining constant vigilance against self-deception, and accepting that certainty itself may be an obstacle to deeper understanding. The process of Hermetic transformation unfolds through distinct stages, each corresponding to both alchemical operations and psychological developments. Jung's exhaustive study of alchemical texts revealed that medieval alchemists were unknowingly describing the individuation process, the natural movement of the psyche toward wholeness that could be either facilitated or obstructed by conscious participation. The first stage, often termed calcination, involves the burning away of attachment to the material world and identification with the ego. Psychologically, this manifests as the breakdown of the persona, that social mask we wear to navigate collective expectations. The individual begins to recognize the artificiality of their carefully constructed identity. This recognition typically arrives through crisis, the loss of a relationship, career failure, existential depression, or any event that shatters the illusion of control. The alchemical fire here is not metaphorical, but experiential. The burning sensation of anxiety, the fever of transformation that consumes the old certainties. Jung understood this stage as the beginning of the confrontation with the unconscious. The ego, having lived in comfortable inflation, believing itself to be the totality of consciousness, discovers vast territories within the psyche that operate autonomously. Dreams become strange and disturbing, offering symbols the conscious mind cannot easily integrate. Synchronicities multiply, suggesting an intelligence operating beyond rational causation. The individual's rational worldview begins to crack, creating the necessary openings for deeper work. The second stage, dissolution, involves the liquefaction of rigid structures through immersion in the unconscious. Where calcination burned away external attachments, dissolution attacks internal rigidities, fixed beliefs, calcified emotional patterns, and the very sense of a stable, continuous self. The alchemical imagery of submersion in water corresponds to the psychological experience of being overwhelmed by emotions previously repressed. The individual may experience waves of grief, rage, or desire that seem disproportionate to present circumstances, eruptions from the personal unconscious that had been contained by rational control. This stage requires what Hermetic texts call the solve phase, dissolution, breaking down, allowing structure to become fluid. Jung noted that patients at this stage often reported dreams of floods, drowning, or dissolution. The terror lies in the loss of psychological boundaries. The ego fears annihilation, not recognizing that only its inflated claims to sovereignty are under threat, not consciousness itself. The individual must learn to float in these waters rather than fight them, to observe the emotional storms without identifying completely with them. The third stage, separation, introduces the crucial capacity for discrimination. Having been dissolved in the waters of the unconscious, the individual must now separate valuable elements from dross. This is the operation Jung associated most closely with the development of psychological insight. The ability to observe oneself objectively, to recognize patterns of behavior and thought without immediate identification, represents a profound development in consciousness. In this stage, the individual begins to separate from parental complexes, recognizing how internalized voices continue to shape their choices. They distinguish between authentic feeling and emotional reactivity, between genuine intuition and wishful thinking. This discrimination is painstaking work, requiring repeated examination of motivations, careful attention to the gap between stated values and actual behavior, and the courage to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about oneself. The fourth stage, conjunction, marks the first major synthesis. The alchemists depicted this as the sacred marriage, the union of opposites within a sealed vessel. Psychologically, conjunction represents the integration of previously split-off aspects of the personality. The individual begins to hold paradox without collapsing into binary thinking. They recognize that they contain both light and shadow, masculine and feminine qualities, rational and irrational capacities, and that health lies not in identifying with one pole while repressing the other, but in conscious relationship with the full spectrum. Jung termed this the integration of the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype within the psyche. For a man, this means recognizing and developing relationship with his inner feminine qualities, receptivity, emotion, relatedness, and intuition. For a woman, it involves integrating masculine aspects, assertiveness, logic, structure, and autonomy. This is not gender stereotyping but recognition of psychological capacities that have been culturally assigned to one gender and thus remain undeveloped in the other. The danger of conjunction lies in premature synthesis. The individual may achieve a temporary integration that collapses under pressure because deeper layers remain unexamined. This is why the alchemical process continues beyond this initial marriage, requiring repeated cycles of dissolution and recombination at ever deeper levels. The fifth stage, fermentation, introduces new life into the process. The alchemical texts describe this as putrefaction, followed by the emergence of new growth, like grain that must die in the earth before sprouting. Psychologically, fermentation corresponds to the activation of the collective unconscious, the encounter with archetypal energies that transcend personal history. At this stage, the individual may experience what religious traditions call spiritual awakening, moments of expanded consciousness, cosmic unity, or direct perception of the numinous. Jung was careful to distinguish such experiences from psychosis. Both involve the eruption of archetypal content into consciousness, but in awakening, the ego maintains relationship with these forces rather than being overwhelmed by them. The alchemist's sealed vessel, the vas hermeticum, represents the therapeutic container, or the disciplined practice that allows these powerful energies to be integrated rather than dissipated or destructive. The sixth stage, distillation, involves progressive refinement. The individual repeatedly returns to earlier stages with increasing subtlety, each cycle removing finer layers of impurity. Psychological distillation manifests as the development of nuanced self-awareness, the capacity to detect increasingly subtle forms of self-deception, identification, and unconscious motivation. The practitioner learns to observe not only gross emotional reactions, but the micro-movements of consciousness, the slight tightening before a defensive reaction, the subtle pleasure taken in another's misfortune, the ways ego continuously attempts to reassert control. This stage requires patience and what Buddhist traditions call bare attention. The Hermetic practitioner develops the ability to witness their own psychological processes without immediate interference, creating the space necessary for genuine insight. This is the stage where formal practices, meditation, contemplation, rigorous self-examination, become essential rather than optional. The seventh and final stage, coagulation, represents the formation of the philosopher's stone, the crystallization of consciousness into a stable, resilient form. Psychologically, this corresponds to what Jung called the realization of the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends and includes the ego. The individual achieves what Maslow later termed self-actualization, though the Hermetic understanding goes deeper, suggesting not merely the fulfillment of human potential, but the manifestation of a transpersonal reality through the purified vehicle of the individual. Coagulation is not a static achievement, but a dynamic stability, the capacity to remain centered while engaging fully with life's vicissitudes. The individual has integrated enough unconscious content that they are no longer puppet to internal complexes. They act from authenticity rather than compulsion, from vision rather than reaction. Yet this achievement brings its own danger. Spiritual inflation, the ego's attempt to appropriate the self's realization and claim it as personal accomplishment. The Hermetic texts warn repeatedly against this final trap, emphasizing that the stone, once achieved, must be continuously renewed, that the great work is never finally complete. Within this structured journey lies a necessary descent into psychological darkness that exceeds all other challenges. The Hermetic tradition identifies this as the Nigredo, the blackening, while Christian mysticism terms it the dark night of the soul. Jung recognized it as the confrontation with the shadow, that aspect of ourselves we have spent a lifetime disowning, projecting onto others, and hiding from conscious awareness. This crisis does not arrive as a single event, but as a progressive revelation of the self's mendacity. The individual discovers that their most cherished self-image is a fabrication, that motives they believed pure are contaminated with selfishness, that values they proclaimed loudly are violated in subtle daily actions, that the very identity they have constructed is a defense against authentic being. This is not the discovery of minor flaws, but the collapse of the personality's foundational narrative. The terror of this stage cannot be overstated. Where earlier stages involve challenging specific beliefs or integrating difficult emotions, the encounter with the shadow threatens the very continuity of self. The individual confronts within themselves the very qualities they most despise in others: cruelty, cowardice, lust, envy, and the capacity for profound self-deception. Worse, they recognize that these are not aberrations, but integral aspects of their psychological structure, operating constantly beneath the threshold of awareness. Jung observed that individuals at this stage often experience what appears clinically as depression, but differs fundamentally in its teleological orientation. Clinical depression frequently lacks direction, circling in repetitive rumination without progress. The existential crisis of the Hermetic path, while equally painful, possesses an inherent movement toward transformation. The difference lies in the presence of meaning, the sense, however obscure, that this suffering serves a purpose beyond itself. The alchemical operation corresponding to this stage is mortificatio, the death process. Medieval texts depict black ravens, skulls, and graves, imagery that Jung recognized as representing ego death. The practitioner must allow the death of who they believe themselves to be, not metaphorically, but experientially. This involves the cessation of the internal narrative that maintains identity continuity, the collapse of defense mechanisms that have operated since childhood, and the terrifying openness to the void that lies beneath constructed selfhood. This stage explains why Hermetic texts consistently warned against premature initiation. The unprepared psyche, lacking sufficient ego strength and psychological resources, cannot survive this disintegration intact. The result is not enlightenment, but breakdown. Not transformation, but fragmentation into psychosis. The modern epidemic of spiritual emergency, individuals who engage with consciousness-altering practices or sudden spiritual experiences without adequate preparation or container, demonstrates the wisdom of the ancient gatekeeping function of mystery schools. What distinguishes this esoteric crisis from pathological depression is precisely its relationship to a larger framework of meaning. The Hermetic practitioner understands, however dimly, that this darkness is part of a process, that the Nigredo precedes the albedo, that death is the necessary prelude to rebirth. This understanding does not alleviate the suffering, but provides the minimal structure necessary to endure it without complete disintegration. The philosophical distinction here is crucial. Modern psychology often treats suffering as pathology to be eliminated as quickly as possible, through medication or cognitive reframing. The Hermetic view recognizes certain forms of suffering as ontologically necessary, built into the structure of transformation itself. To anesthetize this pain is to abort the process, leaving the individual in permanent incompletion. Jung fiercely defended the necessity of the individuation process's painful aspects, warning against the therapeutic temptation to restore the patient to conventional adjustment rather than supporting them through genuine transformation. The confrontation with the shadow reveals that evil is not external but internal, not an abstract theological concept, but a living presence within one's own psyche. This recognition destroys moral simplicity. The individual can no longer maintain comfortable divisions between self and other, good people and bad people, us and them. They recognize their kinship with everything they previously condemned, their capacity for the very acts they judged harshly in others. This moral crisis extends beyond personal ethics to metaphysical questions. If consciousness contains its own negation, if the psyche is structured around fundamental oppositions that cannot be eliminated, then wholeness requires not the triumph of good over evil, but their integration into a higher synthesis that transcends both. This is perhaps the most dangerous implication of Hermetic psychology, the suggestion that conventional morality, with its absolute categories and clear boundaries, represents a stage to be passed through rather than the final word on ethical life. The practitioner at this stage often experiences what mystics call spiritual desolation, the absence of all sense of meaning, purpose, or divine presence. God, if believed in, seems utterly absent or hostile. The universe appears as indifferent mechanism, consciousness as accidental epiphenomenon, and individual existence as cosmic joke. This is not philosophical nihilism adopted as intellectual position, but nihilism experienced as existential reality, the visceral confrontation with meaninglessness that no rational argument can penetrate. Yet the Hermetic tradition maintains that this void is not the final truth, but a necessary passage. The individual must descend to the very bottom of psychological existence, to the bedrock beneath all constructions of meaning, before authentic reconstruction becomes possible. Only that which is built on this foundation, rather than on the illusions of the persona, possesses genuine stability. The philosopher's stone, that legendary culmination of alchemical work, represents not a material substance, but a transformed state of consciousness. Jung identified it with the self, not the ego, but the archetype of wholeness that the ego serves when rightly ordered. The individual who achieves this integration operates from a fundamentally different center than ordinary consciousness. This transformed state manifests first as psychological stability that does not depend on external circumstances. The individual has integrated enough unconscious content that they are no longer puppet to complex and compulsion. External events, whether fortune or misfortune, no longer determine internal state. This is not the Stoics' indifference, but a deeper equanimity born from understanding the temporary nature of all phenomenal experience and the eternal ground of consciousness itself. The second manifestation is ethical clarity without moral rigidity. Having confronted their own shadow, the individual loses interest in projection and judgment. They recognize the same struggles in others that they discovered in themselves, replacing condemnation with compassion. Yet this compassion does not become permissive relativism. The integration of the shadow means acknowledging destructive tendencies without acting upon them, understanding the full spectrum of human capacity while choosing consciously how to direct one's energy. The third quality is what Hermetic texts call the union of opposites. The individual achieves coincidentia oppositorum, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing into binary thinking. They recognize that truth often lies not in choosing between opposing positions, but in understanding their mutual dependence and creative tension. This capacity for paradoxical thinking allows navigation of complexity that defeats dualistic minds. The fourth attribute is creative engagement with life. The alchemical gold is not inert, but living, capable of transmuting other substances. Similarly, the individuated person possesses what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to generate new symbolic meaning that reconciles conscious and unconscious, individual and collective. This manifests as genuine creativity, not mere novelty, but the production of forms that carry numinous power, that speak to and from the collective unconscious. The practical implications for the modern individual are profound. The hermetically trained consciousness approaches professional life differently, recognizing work not as mere economic necessity, but as potential vehicle for the expression of purpose. Relationships transform from ego transactions, arrangements for mutual validation and need fulfillment, into authentic encounters between whole beings capable of genuine intimacy because they are no longer desperate for the other to complete them. The individual's relationship with collective movements and social causes becomes more nuanced. Having recognized within themselves the full spectrum of human tendency, they approach political and social questions with appropriate humility, aware of how easily the reformer becomes the oppressor, how liberation movements spawn new tyrannies, how the best intentions pave roads to destructive outcomes. This awareness does not produce paralysis, but action informed by tragic wisdom, the knowledge that human efforts inevitably carry unintended consequences that must be monitored and adjusted continuously. Yet this achievement brings grave responsibility. The Hermetic texts emphasize that knowledge gained through initiation carries moral obligation. The individual who has developed greater consciousness must use it in service of the collective rather than personal aggrandizement. This is the distinction between the adept and the black magician. Both possess power, but the former subordinates it to ethical purpose, while the latter serves only egoic will. The danger of spiritual inflation looms constantly. The ego, having witnessed profound psychological transformations, attempts to appropriate them as personal achievement. The individual begins to identify as enlightened, awakened or realized, all subtle forms of the very identification that the process was meant to transcend. The Hermetic path requires perpetual vigilance against this trap, continuous return to the recognition that whatever has been achieved is gift rather than attainment, grace rather than accomplishment. The disciplined approach of the Hermetic school becomes essential precisely here. Authentic transformation requires structure, guidance, and community. The romantic notion of the solitary seeker, achieving gnosis through raw willpower, is not only false but dangerous. The alchemist worked within a tradition, consulted texts, learned from masters, and maintained practices that provided container for volatile psychological processes. Modern practitioners require equivalent structures, whether therapeutic relationship, spiritual direction, or rigorous philosophical community, to avoid the pitfalls of premature claims and ungrounded experience. The integration of self-knowledge ultimately manifests as simplicity on the far side of complexity. The individual returns to ordinary life but transfigured, capable of inhabiting the mundane with full consciousness. They wash dishes, pay bills, navigate traffic, attend to daily obligations, but from a center that remains unshaken because it is grounded not in the ephemeral personality, but in the eternal ground of being itself. This is the true gold. Not escape from material existence, but complete presence within it, matter fully unsouled and spirit fully embodied. The Hermetic tradition understood what modern psychology is only beginning to recognize, that consciousness is not a given, but an achievement, that selfhood is not discovered but forged, and that the journey from ignorance to knowledge exacts a price that many, confronted honestly with its cost, would refuse to pay. Yet for those who possess the courage to proceed, who can endure the fires of transformation and the darkness of existential night, who can die to what they were in order to become what they must be, the reward exceeds all conception. The great work is great, not because of what it produces, but because of who it requires you to become. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that lights the fire, maintains the heat, and endures through all seasons until base metal transmutes to radiant consciousness.